I'm back. So in the first tutorial, we learned all about sorting and filtering using the COVID-19 infection and death rate global data. And we were able to discern some very interesting trends. For example, the countries that had the highest number of cases, and we were able to filter for specific months and so on and so forth. And we got a little bit into pivot tables in our class, in our first class. For this particular tutorial, we will focus exclusively on pivot tables and get into some of the reasons why pivot tables are really a lot better and a lot more powerful for analyzing data than just the basic filtering and sorting using a regular table. So we're going to dig into this, and I'll say right off the bat that if at the end of this tutorial, if you still don't quite understand how the pivot table works, the rationale for it, don't worry. Just keep practicing, and at some point it will make sense. But in the meantime, let's get going. Okay, so now we are ready to begin with pivot tables. So we left off with the last tutorial having done a lot of filtering and sorting, and we can see here that the little funnels at the that are next to the filters indicate those columns that have extra filters on them. So in this case, it's A and K. And so if we want to get rid of them, we can do one of two things. We can either select and then clear the filter, or in this case, if we just want to clear all the filters, we can just go up here, clear the filter, and then we're back to the original. So what we want to do is to create a pivot table. We put our cursor in the middle of the table. We go to Insert, and then Pivot Table. This should be similar for Mac users. You basically want to find the functionality that allows you to insert a pivot table, and what you will get is a dialog box here. Okay, and oops, let me see. I did that again. Just let me do this again. Keep making that mistake. Okay, there we go. So we get the dialog box, and a couple of things to keep in mind here is that when you get these marching ants, like I like to call them, surrounding the table, that means that Excel has done the copy. The name in the range here is the actual name of the worksheet, and then the range, which is A1 to M 5207, 2107, that is all of the rows in your table. So you have to make sure that when you're creating a pivot table, it captures the entire table. And as I've mentioned before, the reason you want to do this is that if there is, for whatever reason, a blank row in the middle of your table, the pivot table will stop there and it will not go any further. And so you want to make sure that you don't make that mistake. Page 69 of the Data Journalist, our textbook, covers pivot tables, and we also have a number of exercises as well. So this is this is really great stuff here. So we have the pivot table. We know that we have the range. It defaults to new worksheet. You always want to put it into a new worksheet. I can't think of many reasons for putting the table in the same worksheet. Okay, so if we're okay with this, we want to click OK, and then it opens the pivot table, a new sheet containing the pivot table to the left of your original tab. You might want to click and drag this over to the right side. I don't know about you, but I like reading from left to right, and here you have the pivot table. Now just one quick thing, whenever you click outside the pivot table, you lose this field list here. If that happens to you, it hasn't gone anywhere, don't panic, just click inside the table and it reappears. Okay, so here you have your table, and then in your pivot table fields, you can drag the different columns into the sections here, okay, which allow you to do a number of things. And again, Chapter 4 of the Data Journalist covers a lot more information on pivot tables. So, what do we want to do? Well, it really depends. You can, for example, take the number of, say, deaths, and you can drag it into values. And you probably want to format the numbers as numbers with decimal places, with commas rather. So you click on the field value settings. The pivot table has done the correct math in this case, which is to sum the deaths, but we want to format the numbers. So we'll format it as a number with 0 decimal places and 1,000 separator, and there we have it. So we know that worldwide, for the entire period covered by the pivot table, by the table rather, there were 1.7 million deaths. Now, what we have to use the pivot table for is to divide up that number in a way that makes sense of it. So what we probably want to do is take the countries and drag them into rows, which then groups. So we've taken that figure, okay, which is at the bottom, which is the grand total here at the bottom, which is this 1.1 million figure, okay? And we have essentially subdivided or grouped it by country. So assigned a number of deaths to each country. And then we can sort the column B in descending order by clicking the first cell underneath the title, going to data, and then we can sort from Z to A. And we can see that the United States had 227,700 deaths from June the 1st, 2020 to October the 29th, 2020, which is the period covered by this particular data set. Okay, so this is all well and good, but we probably want to do a bit more with this. So what else might we want to do? Well, we could see how does how can we subdivide that 227,000 figure even more? Well, we might want to do it by month. So if we drag the months into the columns, we can see that in fact that 227,000 figure is now subdivided by month. Okay? And 1, 2, 3, that's January, February, March, April. The numbers represent the months. Because there was nothing really happening in December, we probably can filter out December, which is 12, and we can see that there's not a whole lot happening in January either. Really, the action started to happen in March, April, May, but we'll leave January there for the time being. So what our pivot table has done is it has summed all of the deaths, it has grouped them by geography, and it has subdivided that number by month. And so this could actually be your first pivot table. Right? And just by eyeballing this, you can see that there are trends. So we can see when it comes to deaths, for example, that the high water mark for many countries like the United States was in April. April, May, okay? Those are really the deadliest months for a lot of countries, which makes sense because that's when a lot of jurisdictions were forced into lockdowns. Okay? So this is the first pivot table, and we can name this. We can call it pivot table, and then deaths. And the reason that I'm saving space here is that these tabs have a certain number of characters. So you don't want to use spaces, and you want to be economical with your titles. So if it's a multi-word title, just make sure that each word starts with capital. So at least you can look at this and you can see that, oh yes, it's pivot table deaths. Okay, so that's the first pivot table that we've done, and that's not too bad. Okay, so now, we might want to filter this. We might want to say, okay, that's fine, but we want to be a little bit more granular in our analysis. So let's take the continent and drag it into the filter. Oops. That should be the continent, and we can drag it. Oh, I keep making that mistake. Take the continent, right, and drag it into the filter. There we go. And then we can select and then deselect, and let's take Europe, for example. And in Europe, we can see that the UK had the highest number of deaths for that time period, from January to almost the end of October, and then Italy, France, Spain, Russia, and so on. And this can give, if you're doing a story, you could always do a top 10 list, for example, the top 20 list, and just to take a look at deaths. So if you're happy with this, just keep saving during each step, which is a good thing to do. And so this can be your first pivot table. Now let's just think about another pivot table that we might want to do. So instead of reinventing the wheel, all we're going to do is select the entire worksheet. We're going to copy. We're going to open up a new worksheet, and we're just going to actually paste the pivot table into here. And you might be asking yourself, well, why would we copy and paste the entire pivot table? And the reason being is that the second pivot table is going to be very similar to this. So we've got most of the coordinates we want here. So let's just call this, double click on this tab here, and we'll call this pivot table cases. And from the title, you get an idea of what we're going to do. So let's drag the continents out for now, and then we'll drag the sum of deaths out. We want to keep the months and we want to keep the countries. We still want to group by countries, we still want to subdivide by month, but instead of summing the deaths, we want to sum the cases. So we'll drag the cases in here, and then we have to format the numbers. It's summing, so it's doing the right math, but we want to format the numbers. We don't want any decimal places, and we want to use the thousand separator, and there we go. And then we can sort the grand total in descending order, and we can see that I want the cases, I don't want the deaths. So let's just do that, sum of cases. And there we go, the number, thousand separator. Okay, sort in descending order. And then we are good to go. Now, what's really interesting is if you eyeball the cases, you can see that the number of cases have actually crept up. Okay, they have really increased. And there's a reason for that. Because a lot of countries like the United States, Canada, they're testing more. So if you test more, you're going to get a lot of cases. And we are now into a second wave with economies having opened up. People going back to school, there are just more cases. So that is reflective of the trend. But if we toggle back here to the number of deaths, we can see that the deaths really haven't increased dramatically. And so that is very interesting. So if we, for example, if we just take a look at all of the deaths, for example, okay, so we can see that here we go. Okay. Okay, so we can see that the number of deaths are not really increasing. If we can compare what happened in October to say what happened at the height of the deaths, which was April and May, we can see that in October, and we're almost at the end of October, it's less than half. Okay, so while the number of deaths really hasn't increased markedly, okay, the number of cases has increased. So without really resorting to pivot tables to help you with your analysis, it's hard to really arrive at those sort of conclusions. Okay? So if you're happy with this, again, we can, if we wanted to drag say the continent into your filters, we could do the same thing, and it's already filtered for Europe, so we can do that. We can leave Europe, or if we wanted to look at the America, for example, we can do that. Okay? So let's just save that, and that's not bad. Okay, so now we've got two pivot tables, and it's fairly straightforward. Now we're going to figure out, okay, well, we've got the number of deaths, we've got the number of cases, but wouldn't it be interesting to figure out the death rate? Well, you may recall that if we go back to the original table, in this column here, column J, we actually have population figures. So each time of a country's case and death count is entered into the database, each day, the population is re-entered. Okay? So that allows us then to figure out a rate. So we'll create a new pivot table, paste it, and we'll call this pivot table, and we'll call it death rate. Deaths and population, because we won't quite figure out the rate yet. We're about couple of steps away from that. Deaths and population. Okay? And so let's drag the number of cases out. We don't need that. We drag the month out. We don't need that. And we're going to drag the population into the values. Okay? And we'll sort this in descending order. And we're not going to filter by continent either, so we'll drag that out. Okay? And so we will now sort this in descending order. Oops. Just increase that. Let's sort the countries in ascending order, right? Because I want to show you something that seems a little absurd. And now we are going to format these countries as numbers, no decimal places, and we'll use 1,000 separator. All right. I don't know about you, but I don't think Afghanistan has 11 billion people. Okay, so what's going on, right? Well, if we actually click on this 11 billion number, we will see the table that exists underneath, right? It opens a table to the left, and we can see what's going on here, all right? So yes, it has given us the entire subcategory or subtable for Afghanistan, but what it has also done is it has also summed, okay, all of the population numbers for each entry. And we don't want it to do that. We only want one population number. Okay? So we have to trick the pivot table into thinking that we're only going to be using one population number, okay, not several. Okay? So what we want to do is we want to change the math from sum to maximum. And we can format the number in the same way, sum or maximum. You could also do average, right? And then you hit enter. So what that does is you're taking the maximum value, okay, of each entry. Well, we know, if we go back to this sheet 1 here, we know that every entry, population entry, okay, is the same number. Okay, because it's re-entered every single time, right? And in this case, it's re-entered. There are 294 rows, okay, that have information about Afghanistan. And in every one of those 294 cases, your population number is increased. So you don't want your pivot table to sum all of those populations. You just want to take the maximum value, which in this case is 38 million. Okay, so that's how we can trick the pivot table into giving us one population value. So what we can do then is we can take the deaths and we can also drag it into the values. And oh, Excel has guessed wrong. It wants us, we don't want to count, we want to sum. So we have to change the math, change it to sum, go to number format, oops, change it to sum, go to number format, no decimal places, and we use the thousand separator. Whoops. Keep dragging the wrong things in here. Okay, let's try this again. Deaths, drag deaths, there we go. Sum, number, whoops. The mouse is acting up here. Okay, and your thousand separator, and there you have it. Okay, so in Afghanistan, population of 38 million, and it had 1,529 deaths for the 9-month period covered by the data, which is fine. So now what we can do is we are going to create a new table where we're going to simply divide the number of, we're going to divide the population into the number of deaths, and then we're going to multiply that by 100,000 to get a death rate of 100,000. Okay? So to do that, we are going to copy this entire table. We're going to go to a new worksheet, but instead, and don't go too quickly here, instead of just pasting it, we're going to use what's called a paste special. Okay? A paste special just pastes the values into the table and not the actual everything that Excel uses to create the pivot table. Right? It's just going to paste the values. So that's very important. Just paste the values. So paste values, and what you can see here is that now it has pasted the values, but it has stripped all of the numbers of their formatting. So we'll have to do a little bit of cleanup here. Okay? So what we want to do is, let's just delete the first two rows. And we delete the first two rows by highlighting row 1 and 2, right click, and we can delete. Make sure do not highlight and delete from your keyboard, because what will happen is you will delete the contents from the row or the cell or the column, but you will leave the actual column or cell blank, and you don't want to do that. You want to eliminate it entirely. And then we probably don't want to be calling column A row label. We might want to call it something like jurisdiction. Okay? Jurisdiction. Okay? And then let's call this population. And sum of deaths is fine. Okay? And we probably want to then reformat these numbers. Okay, from general to number, no decimal places, 1,000 separator, and there we have it. In column D, we're going to figure out the rate, right? So we can call this death rate. And then our formula is equals, okay, open bracket, and we're going to divide the sum of deaths by the population, close bracket. And we're going to multiply, which is the asterisk, by 100,000. Don't use any commas in the number. Okay? Now, just before I hit enter, I'll just explain what's going on here. The reason that we want to put the division in brackets is because Excel does that calculation first. We want it to figure out the percentage first, then we will multiply it by 100,000. So the sum of deaths is the numerator, the population is the denominator. Okay? For those who are doing a lot of analysis using ratios and so on, figuring out what your numerator is easy enough. It's the number that you care most about, but determining your denominator might be a little tougher. So that you might have to put a little bit more thought into it. But in this case, the denominator is the population. We can hit enter, And then we are going to format this as a number with 1 decimal place. And then we will copy it all the way down. And let's just make sure that it does copy all the way down, which it does. And, oh, I forgot to do one thing. We don't need the grand total here. We can get rid of that. Okay. And we can scroll back to the top. And now we can sort column D in descending order. Now we have these errors. The error basically means that we can't divide by 0 or an empty cell. Okay? So what we're going to do is activate the filter. And for the purposes of this exercise, we will just filter that out. And we can see that San Marino had the highest death rate, but San Marino has a very small population and a small number of deaths. So obviously your jurisdictions with your smallest population are going to have higher rates. So we might want to look past the very small countries and look at the largest countries, larger countries like Belgium, for example, has a high death rate. Spain has a higher death rate. Bolivia, Brazil, the United States is up there. But for all the talk of, we've heard about the United States, there are other countries that have higher death rates. Okay, so if we were to use this for our analysis, for example, we can see that the United States is 11th. And where is Canada? My goodness, where is Canada? Okay, Canada is down there, right? So Canada is, if we just use this, Canada is has the 40th highest death rate. Okay, so figuring out a rate then allows us to do analysis that is a little bit more meaningful, because now we can compare countries of different sizes because we have the rates. And so these are the kinds of things, this grouping and counting and rates. These are the kinds of things that we can do with pivot tables that we can't do with normal tables. That concludes our tutorial on pivot tables. As you can see, there are lots of really interesting analysis that you can do just by grouping and counting and subdividing over a number of months. You can either eyeball trends, you can see where the hotspots are, or as we did in one of the very last steps, you can actually figure out ratios, which then allow you to ratios and rates, which then allow you to compare countries to see which ones have the higher death rates or which ones have the highest infection rates. So what you might want to do is, instead of you might want to go beyond death rates and create another pivot table and another table using paste special that looks at the infection rate, doing the same thing. The bottom line here is that this takes a lot of practice, a lot of repetition. If you don't get it right away, don't worry. If you practice, it will make sense. But without a doubt, pivot tables are probably the most useful thing that you will learn. And if you understand pivot tables, then you can get into, when you get into visualization and mapping, that will make a lot more sense as well. So I hope that you found this useful.